Welcome to this session. My name is David Fagerberg. I'm in the theology department here at Notre Dame, and it's my pleasure to introduce Ralph Wood. In the biographical sketch which the Center for Ethics and Culture provided me, I was struck by Professor Wood's description of his own Tertullian moment. I refer to the famous question, what has Jerusalem to do with Athens, whereby Tertullian set in motion the discussion between faith on the one hand and reason and culture on the other. Only Professor Wood's Tertullian moment came, he says, from an evangelist who once asked him, since you done got Jesus, how come you need Shakespeare? His career may be said to reflect a careful and productive search for the answer to this question. It began with a bachelor and master's degree from East Texas State University, then a master's degree and doctorate at the Divinity School of the University of Chicago. The theme throughout was the relation of Christian theology to the chief literary texts in the West. He has been active in the Southern Baptist Church as deacon, teacher, and lay preacher. Simultaneously, he has been active in the academy, teaching at Wake Forest in North Carolina, Samford University in Birmingham, and he is currently Baylor University Professor of Theology and Literature in Texas. His teaching excellence has been acknowledged by 2 prizes for excellence in the classroom, and his scholarly excellence has been recognized by publishers. Author of 5 books, the most prominent being entitled The Comedy of Redemption, Christian Faith and Comic Vision in 4 American Novelists. And with those books come 70 essays and service as editor-at-large for the Christian Century and membership on the editorial board for the Flannery O'Connor Review. We are delighted that he had time to join us today. Would you join me in welcoming Professor Wood?
Thank you, Professor Fagerberg, very much. I've said to him before I came into the room how much I've enjoyed his book on Chesterton, which I commend to you very highly if you don't know. We at Baylor feel ourselves very closely related to you folks at Notre Dame. I've been here 6 times in the last 6 years when I had not been to Notre Dame once during my previous 26 years in the classroom. So it's been a delight. The relation's often, however, very one-sided as we Baptists try to figure out what our right relation is to you Catholics. So we sometimes promote little ecumenical endeavors whereby we will have, for example, cross-visitation of churches. You may have heard about the time that happened when a young Baptist boy visited the parish of his Catholic friend and vice versa. And that was, as it was over, the Catholic boy turned to the Baptist and said, well, was there anything going on at our church that needs explaining? And the Baptist boy waving his arm said, everything needs explaining. What's that? You know, you get down on your knees, you bow, you make this kind of Masonic signal across your chest. You've got all this smoke up front. You know, I've got everything to understand. Please explain it to me. So after a long while, the Catholic boy got through his explanation. And the Baptist boy then turned to him and said, well, was there anything about our service that you need to have explained? He said, Catholic boy said, no, pretty obvious, a concert followed by a lecture. However, he said, there was one matter I didn't understand. What does it mean when the minister takes off his watch and places it on the pulpit? And the Baptist boy said, it doesn't mean a thing. So I hope it will mean something. I'm going to try to stay within my limits here. Another example, however, of our relation with Notre Dame being complicated, one of our major problems, and one reason I'm addressing this problem in my paper this morning, is what we call Baptist individualism. Very low estimate of the place of the church and the communal life in being Christian. So a lot of our evangelical students boast of the fact that they don't need the church because they have Jesus in their heart, that they can feel him, they can talk to him. In fact, he does things for them when they ask. And one of the most notable examples of this kind of piety is that students tell me, you know, we have a very crowded campus and extremely hard to find a parking place, but when I pray to Jesus, he finds me one. And so I say, okay, Baylor has touchdown Jesus, Notre Dame has touchdown Jesus, Baylor has parking Jesus. And I'll take the former anytime, given the state of our football team. I have a written formal version of this essay. I'm going to try to talk, and that's going to mean a little bit of clumsiness. I have an outline on one side and a text on the other, so pardon me if I do some shifting back and forth. What I want to make out as a case today is that Tolkien is susceptible of a postmodern reading. I've not argued this case before, so it will be a bit clumsy. You'll need to help me. I've written a book on Tolkien. I didn't want to simply get up and rehearse that book. You can read that for yourself. But to make a case that I think is right, though rough, not just to try to do something different or unusual, but to try to rescue Tolkien from the charge that he's just a reactionary. And that people are drawn to him out of a kind of nostalgia for the antique past. And that therefore he really is irrelevant to the major issues of our time, concerns of our time, and therefore only naive people who can't see those problems, those concerns of the postmodern world, thus flock to Tolkien and find in him a kind of easy solution. In fact, there's good evidence not only for not reading Tolkien in postmodern terms, but for reading him instead in premodern terms. I mean, Tolkien is, it seems to me, in many ways, some of you know these ways, quite premodern. I'll close this door if that's okay. Come in. Great, come on in. Just for you, we're waiting. For example, talking about Tolkien's antiquarian, kind of radical premodernism, he thought all of English culture was downhill after 1066, that nothing significant happened. He despised the imposition of Norman culture on a vibrant English tradition that had flourished for more than 500 years. He looked upon the Arthurian legends as an alien French import, and thus utterly unfit to be the basis for a national mythology. He lamented Chaucer's introduction of Italian iambic meter into English poetry. He regarded Shakespeare as hopelessly modern because so many of his characters remained so obsessively subjective in their quandaries. He judged the Reformation to be a terrible error, insisting, for example, that the cathedrals of England were stolen Catholic property. The booty of what G.K. Chesterton called, in a very fine phrase, the revolution of the rich. I visited Priscilla Tolkien in 1988, Tolkien's daughter, had a wonderful afternoon with her. But she said to me at one point of our visit, she said, you know, my father would have had no use for you. That got my attention rather drastically. I said, how's that? She said, you're a Baptist. And what I learned that she meant by that was that Tolkien's grandmother had been Baptist, and that when Mrs. Tolkien, his own mother, converted to Catholicism in the year 1900, she was rejected utterly by both sides of her family, her Baptist family on her side and her husband's Unitarian family. And so Mrs. Tolkien was left to rear those two boys because Mr. Tolkien, of course, had died in South Africa by herself. And as you probably know, she ruined her health by overwork and died young, and thus Tolkien was left motherless. And he regarded his mother as a kind of martyr to the faith, that she had died, that these boys would be reared in a kind of a radically countercultural form of Christianity, which of course Catholicism by definition must be in England, which at that time was the most fiercely anti-Catholic country in Europe. So she said when he sat down to write, however, all that fell away. All those old, he's a real pre-Vatican II Catholic, despised the vernacular Mass, referred to the twittering owls of the Agnus Dei, yoo-hoo, 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 that he despised. But he said when he began to write, he settled upon what his friend C.S. Lewis called mere Christianity. Essential, bedrock, foundational, non-negotiable, common Christianity. Yet it must be said that Tolkien was a bit resentful that his friend C.S. Lewis never converted to Rome, remaining instead what Tolkien called an Ulster Protestant. Not a friendly term, of course. Well, this litany of Tolkien's anti-modernity could be extended almost endlessly. He was a confessed Luddite, for example, who lamented the triumph of the machine, as he described the Industrial Revolution and all its pomps. He refused to drive a motor car once he saw the damage that paved roads and automobiles had done to the English countryside. He remained a lifelong Tory and an unapologetic monarchist in his politics. For example, he longed for the return of Roman Catholicism as the established state church of England. And in both his poetry and his prose, Tolkien had repeated recourse to decidedly premodern literary forms, especially, of course, the epic and the romance. As Kenneth Craven has recently written, J.R.R. Tolkien was an ancient in the sense that he never wanted to live in the present time, but in saner ages and in eternity. Tolkien was as ancient as Treebeard, a mossy poet who lived in the languages and poems of the Dark Ages. So there's plenty of evidence that Tolkien can be read as an anti-modern and not as a postmodern. Yet I want to make the counter, maybe very counterintuitive case, that he does also lend himself to a postmodern reading. And so what I want to argue then, after I've given a definition of what I understand modernism and its counterpart, postmodernism, to be, to suggest four ways in which Tolkien can be read in postmodern terms. I'll list them, but I'll name them again later. First, his praise for cultural pluralism as a necessary good in order for particular peoples to prosper. Second, his refusal to view the world sub specie aeternitatis, insisting instead that knowledge and truth are historically located and grounded. Three, his conviction that modern culture has been wickedly coercive in its false claims to universality, especially wicked in its resulting coercions and warfare. And finally, that the best means of combating these modern evils is to be found in small communities of the weak and the emarginated who overcome modern self-aggrandizing individualism by refusing all coercive power. And then finally, in a brief postlude, I will suggest how Tolkien's work remains radically relevant for the culture of life and thus for the epiphanies of beauty amidst the culture of death and the deceits of modernity. In other words, I want to be asking how we can not only read Tolkien or write, but make use of Tolkien as a kind of exemplar for our own postmodern lives as Christians. You probably know that Richard Rorty, one of the inventors of the term postmodern, has now suggested we drop it. He says it is so elusive in its meaning and so crude in its overuse that it ceased to specify anything definable. And certainly the term has been overused, but insofar as it has most succinctly been defined, though I think wrongly, been defined by Jean-Francois Lyotard, and many of you know, in his celebrated claim that to be postmodern is to harbor an incredulity toward meta-narratives. I don't take that claim seriously because his very assertion that there can be no totalizing account of human existence is rather like the declaration that there can be no truth, which is presumably itself a true declaration. So what Lyotard has done unwittingly, I think, is to narrate what's become the chief meta-narrative of the postmodern world, namely that there are no meta-narratives. That's itself a sort of meta-narrative. It's far more helpful, it seems to me, is the confession that we have come to the end of the modern age, insofar as it was built upon the attempt to determine truth from the viewpoint that Søren Kierkegaard called sub specie aeternitatis. For it seems to me at the very heart of the Enlightenment project lies this notion that we can stand above the flux of history and view it from outside the universe, examining it under the aspect of eternity or from a timeless and nameless place. So, what does a modern project involve that makes the postmodern so unwilling to embrace it? I think it involves a deliberate distancing of ourselves from the past, from received traditions, and simply from the given. It is the task of extricating ourselves from previous ages, previous traditions that we regard as now naive and impossible to embrace. As Gustavo Benavides observes, however, this task of self-extrication is perpetual. Once you've extricated yourself from this tradition, why can't you extricate yourself from the tradition which you now occupy? So, for example, we are now extricating ourselves from modernity. And so in that sense, postmodernism is an extension of modernism. It's an act of still, once again, self-extrication. The problem remains then in determining what traditions we postmoderns want to claim and what we want to reject. Let me be very clear that there are several forms of modernism that the postmoderns want to reject. Here are the most obvious ones. First of all, its endless self-reflexivity, and thus its cognitive instability. As I say, once you turn in upon yourself, and rather than accepting the given, but start to look critically and distance yourself, critically at it and distance yourself from it, then you simply keep that act of self-examination, self-criticism going in a kind of endlessly circular and deadly way. Secondly, its division, its domestication of ordinary life into separate domains. One of the chief tasks of modernity, to divide the sacred and the secular, the public and the private, the political and the individual, work and play. A third, its creation of massive bureaucracy through centralized state power. I'm not going to address any of those, simply want to lay out what are the complaints postmodernists have against modernism. Fourth, its elevation of impersonal scientific experiment and proof over religious ritual and sacrament. Fifth, its enlargement of the conceptual realm over the narrative and storied world. And finally, its inadvertent creation, by way of reaction and rebellion, of a radically subjective art and a radically experiential religion. So my business about parking Jesus, you see, is actually a product of modernity. Modernity has turned religion inward and experiential and subjective, and these kids who think they are so traditional and conservative are in fact good little modern liberals without knowing it. Well, if that's the modernist project, put succinctly by Benavides, he also says then that postmodernism is trying to reverse all of those essential tendencies of modernism. And those essential tendencies, again, very helpful, it seems to me, from Benavides. First, modernism moves from the organic to the mechanic, from the corporate to the individual, from hierarchy to equality. And I think most important for us as Christians, from an understanding in which everything resonates with everything else. That's the fundamentally sacramental understanding, of course, of reality, where everything resonates with everything else, to a world built around precision and increased differentiation of domains. But this very postmodern rejection of the modern project doesn't entail any return to a pristine past. That's what I'm trying to argue that Tolkien does not do. He doesn't want us to return to some pristine past, but rather to retrieve particular traditions for peculiarly postmodern Christian uses. All right? Let me briefly account for how I understand the whole postmodern project to have arisen. especially in its stress on the individual. That's my main object of opposition this morning. It arose primarily in the 17th century with an attempt to bring to an end the wars of religion, the so-called wars of religion. As the great philosophers of the Enlightenment believed they could occupy a kind of neutral perch high above both the heavens and the earth, and from this oxymoronic stance in midair, they would look down godlike and neutral upon all the religions and moralities of the world, and then choose out what they thought to be the best ethical, spiritual truths, those that redound to the good of humanity as a whole, what Charles Taylor calls general benevolence. But Lord Herbert of Cherbury famously formulated what he called the 5 reasonable propositions concerning God and morals that all people of all times have held, without regard to race or religion, except when they've been obscured by the distortions and accretions of so-called revealed truths. You know those famous 5 premises of Lord Herbert. 1, that God exists. 2, that he ought to be worshipped. 3, that virtue and piety are the chief part of worship. 4, that there must be repentance for crimes and vices. 5, that there are rewards and punishments in the life to come based on the ways we've acquitted ourselves in this earthly life. I once wrote those 5 propositions, and then the student wrote beneath them, and ice cream tastes good. In other words, a making of the obvious more obvious in perfectly obvious terms. But this seemingly salutary aim of Locke and Herbert, of Jefferson and the American founders, as I say, was intended to prevent the continuing warring, battling among Christians, to bring it to a stop, this internecine strife. And so it came to birth, this modern kind of individualism, and especially the notion of tolerance, in the Treaty of Westphalia, in Locke's essay on toleration, and Jefferson's notes on Virginia. However, William Cavanaugh, everyone know his work, very important work, a Catholic thinker, offers a radically counter account of that version of how tolerance arose. Cavanaugh demonstrates that the halting of the so-called religious wars was less a political necessity than a political convenience. According to him, these wars marked the birth pangs of the sovereign, modern nation state. Political power was seized upon, argues Cavanaugh, so as to give national governments, I'm quoting him, a monopoly on violence within a defined territory. Not stopping it, just giving them a monopoly. So public discourse, as you know, was thoroughly secularized during the Enlightenment. What I've just read is thoroughly secularized public discourse. It was so secularized, he argues, in order to save the state from the threat posed by the churches. He said Christianity produces divisions within the state body, precisely because it is a body which transcends state boundaries, and therefore you better put controls on it. And the way you do it, of course, is by reducing religion to the private sphere. Law, for example, is no longer disclosed or regarded as having been disclosed from its divine source and thus work itself out through custom and tradition. Instead, now, for the first time, law is a thing to be made. You make laws. You legislate them, of course, by the power of the state. You remember in the Shire, there are no laws that had been made. The Shire is governed simply by the received, accepted customs and traditions. Cavanaugh points up the terribly ironic consequence of this new birth of state-enforced tolerance, namely its thoroughgoing exclusion of all publicly ordered religions and all historically nourished traditions. They're excluded from the public realm. And above all, of course, this kind of Enlightenment tolerance excludes the body of the church as a rival to the state body by redefining religion as a purely internal matter, an affair of the soul and not of the body. So you have this tremendous irony. Tolerance is supposed to make the world open and accepting of everybody, and it winds up being the most exclusive form of modernity. Well, this rise of the modern nation state is premised, of course, on an elevation of the autonomous individual, defined largely by his accumulation of privately owned goods. In other words, human beings become largely propertied creatures who have relation to each other largely by means of self-protecting contracts. Society becomes contractual. These contracts, in turn, have a temporal duration. They last as long as the contracting parties are agreed to let them last. They're contingent upon that agreement. And contracts come to replace covenants. So argues Kavanaugh. Covenants, by contrast, are not breakable. Covenants deriving, of course, from the covenant God makes with his people are indissoluble. And, of course, the covenants are sealed by the sacraments. You don't undo a sacrament. Listen to the language, for example, of Descartes. It's not surprising that Descartes placed among the antique excesses what he called all the promises by which one curtails something of one's freedom. That is part of the antique prejudice we've got to get rid of. The notion that one's freedom can be curtailed by promises. Not surprising that Milton wrote a treatise on divorce, or that Kant condemned the covenants, again quoting, Kant condemned covenants that bind one's descendants. Well, what happens here, of course, is an entirely new conception of freedom arises with modernity. Freedom before had been defined, of course, something like faithful obedience to a telos that transcends ourselves. Now freedom is defined as the capacity to choose for oneself whatever one wants to be, and therefore to construe reality as one wants it to be. Some of you know in the famous Supreme Court case upholding Roe v. Wade, Anthony Kennedy, of all things a Catholic, argued that we must always preserve the freedom for everyone to construe reality as he sees fit. It's the kind of ultimate modern conception, it seems to me. Anyhow, this individualism thus comes to mean you can make up your identity entirely out of whole cloth. Freedom means you can strip away all bothersome particularities that locate us within concrete narrative traditions. And thus we can rid ourselves of troublesome commitments and obligations that we've not chosen for ourselves. In some, we can be entirely autonomous selves, immunized from all moral, social obligation except those which we have independently elected. That, in rough shape, then, is the modern project as it concerns this matter of individual autonomy and freedom. Listen to how Alistair MacIntyre construes an anti-modern world. He says, in the world of our foreparents, character was a moral ideal that legitimated certain modes of social existence. Wife, brother, cousin, household servant, village tribesman, these social roles, notice, were not accidental. Things that must be sloughed off for one to be free and one's true self to be disclosed. They provide, on the contrary, the very essential framework of one's being. Your role is who you are. You don't choose to be whatever you want to be. Your role is a matter of a synthesis between societal expectation and personal will coming to juncture. He says, to know oneself as a social person is not to occupy a static and fixed position. Listen to how close this is to Tolkien. It is to find oneself placed within a certain point on a journey with set goals. What Tolkien will, of course, call a quest. To move through life is to make progress, or fail to make progress toward a given end. Thus, a completed and fulfilled life is an achievement, and death is the point at which one can be judged happy or unhappy. Hence, the ancient Greek proverb called no man happy until he's dead. We've turned things exactly upside down. Death is the ultimate enemy in our culture. It's now regarded as a disease that will eventually, I guess, be cured. And the Genome Project, if it succeeds, will cure us before we get sick. Remarkable kind of notion. When I teach Tolkien, I point out one of the terrible curses of the ring is its ongoing, endless life. It lets you live longer and longer and longer, but doesn't make life any better. Gollum has lived 500 years. Look what a pathetic, distorted, twisted, unrecognizable creature he is for his very longevity. My friend Stanley Hauerwas at Duke, formerly at Notre Dame, says, if you ask the average American, what is the purpose of life? If in a moment of candor the average American would answer, he or she would answer, the purpose of life is not to die, but to stay alive as long as possible, to have a good time. I asked my students, what by contrast would the Christian understanding of the purpose of life be? And they stutter, stammer, until we get around to the answer. The Christian understanding of life's purpose is to die, precisely, to die rightly, to die well, to die faithfully. So that's, of course, how death is understood in Tolkien. So, this is what the whole, seems to me, the postmodern project is about, trying to reject these false modern understandings of what it means to be a human being in those particular ways, especially that one way of individualism. So let's look at the four ways in which Tolkien, seems to me, opens himself up to a postmodern reading. The first is his cultural pluralism. Now, I mean by this not that Tolkien is a multiculturalist. I'm not saying that. He's a cultural pluralist, but not a multiculturalist. The distinction, as I understand it, is that a multiculturalist believes that all cultures are more or less equal, and that therefore there's no way for judging among them. And thus it's radically relativistic. Tolkien, by contrast, is a pluralist who very highly values other cultures, but in a way that still lets him choose and select among them. Not by standing above them and outside them, but as a Christian, confessing that he is viewing them from the angle of Christian vision. And so he retrieves from those cultures what he thinks is right and good, and of course he likewise rejects from those cultures what he thinks is evil. For example, in the case of the Nordic cultures he revered so highly, he leaves out a great deal. Tom Shippey has pointed out, for example, some of the things that Tolkien leaves out. Let's see if I can find the quote from Shippey. It's really funny. Hang on just a minute. As I said, I have to do some shifting back and forth here. It's on the previous page. Yeah, here it is. Tolkien leaves out, for example, the terrible vices endemic to most ancient northern cultures that he so greatly admired: witchcraft, slavery, incest, polygamy, human sacrifice. In fact, Shippey accuses Tolkien of having sanitized the northern world. For example, there are no four-letter epithets that so wonderfully salt the Anglo-Saxon tongue to be found anywhere in Lord of the Rings. This is his mot juste about Tolkien. He says, his characters are so virtuous that one can hardly call them pagans at all. You know, Augustine spoke of the virtuous pagans that we must admire. They can be hardly called pagans at all. So but the point is, he is retrieving from those cultures what he thinks is worthy of Christian affirmation. And thus, he is really a cultural pluralist and not a multiculturalist. Just a couple examples of that. Shippey points out, this is also pointed out, by the way, by John Garth. You know that new book by Garth called Tolkien and the Great War? It seems to me the three essential books, if you're going to do Tolkien studies beyond The Lord of the Rings, are, of course, Humphrey Carpenter's great biography, Shippey's The Road to Middle-earth in its new revised edition. But now this new book by a British journalist called Tolkien and the Great War. Because he shows how decisively the Great War shaped Tolkien's whole imagination, that he began to be concerned, as he was before, to write and create languages, Sindarin and Quenya, based, for example, on Welsh and Finnish, in the conviction that languages and cultures are inextricably rooted in time and place. That geography is hugely determinative for the way people think and act. That human variety is tied to the knotty particulars of culture. That a people's first products are its myths and stories. And that these narratives are the essential carriers of both religion and morality. When Tolkien was told, for example, that English is about to become the lingua franca of the modern capitalist world, he was horrified that his own language would become now the standard so-called universal language. So what that would do, of course, would be to destroy the vitality of the many local languages that English would replace. And it was also, of course, ruin the rich local dialects of English itself. For example, my deep southern speech that some of you, no doubt, are having difficulty comprehending up here in what we in the South call the deep north. So what Tolkien does then is to let the various traditions intersect each other, let them enter conversation with each other, let them persuade each other. Not that they're all indistinguishable, far from it, but they're part of what I'm going to be calling at the very end of my little address here, the tournament of narratives, or the tournament of traditions. Secondly, in addition to Tolkien's cultural pluralism, he is convinced, seems to me, as his friend C.S. Lewis was not convinced, that Christianity does not rely on any kind of foundationalism. C.S. Lewis believed that unless you can, first of all, hold to a certain worldview that will admit the possibility of miracles, for example, you will never become a Christian. So he writes an entire book entitled Miracles, trying to persuade secular people of a worldview that would let them then enter Christianity. Tolkien doesn't do that. You should know that Tolkien intensely disliked his friend C.S. Lewis's apologetic work, Mere Christianity, Problem of Pain, so forth and so on. He called Lewis every man's theologian. If you're British, you know that's not a compliment. Every man is British parlance for Joe Blow, Joe Blow's theologian. He thought Christian faith does not need defending. That's a modern project. And so look how differently Lewis's and Tolkien's fiction proceeds. In Lewis, there's a parallel universe which readers must first believe before they can enter into it imaginatively. So we move from the natural and the ordinary to the magical and the supernatural realm, as if they were essentially disjunct, even though they're finally knitted together. Lucy, Edmund, Susan, Peter pass through the wardrobe into Narnia. Ransom travels by spaceship from the earth to Malacandra and then to Paralandra. In Lewis's fiction, the realm of deep magic, as he calls it, always lies on the other side of the quotidian world. Not so for Tolkien. Much more Aristotelian in his conviction that transcendent realities to be found in the depths of this world, not in some arcane existence beyond it. So what does he do in The Lord of the Rings? He simply sets us down in Middle-earth. There's no preparation where he sets us up to believe this world to be credible. He simply lets us enter that world and show us how utterly credible it is. He said, for example, fairy stories cannot tolerate any frame or machinery suggesting that the whole story which they occur is figment or illusion. I say, he would by extension say, Christianity doesn't need any frame larger than itself in which to place it. That's what apologetics of the modern kind tries to do. So he simply sets us down right in the middle of Middle-earth, a world that has no other foundation than its own laws and conventions. Thirdly, Tolkien's rejection of the culture of death insofar as it's the culture of coercion. This is why the John Garth book is so very important. He shows that Tolkien was so drastically shaped by his experience in the First War, once called the Great War, that he could never complete the project of his Grand Legendarium in the way he had set out to write it. Tolkien wanted to write what he called a mythology for England. He felt that England did not have its own real mythology. It borrowed this Arthurian stuff from France. Tolkien hated everything French. He called French a nose disease, the language itself, with its famous 5 vowels, Tolkien experienced the horrors of the First War with the conviction that something new had entered modern life, that there had occurred a fundamental cleavage in Western culture at Verdun and Passchendaele, at Ypres and the Somme. For these battles were conducted not with swords and catapults and rifles, but with tanks and howitzers and airplanes. Here was revealed the essential modernist legacy, the murderous machine. For these new instruments of war were designed no longer to kill individual soldiers, but to obliterate entire towns, to blast the countryside clean of forests and farms, and thus to lay waste to nearly everything. This was the age of routine bombardment of civilian populations, the use of famine as a political measure, the revival of judicial torture, the liquidation of whole classes of political opponents, and the continuing development of weapons of mass destruction, such as chlorine gas and the hydrogen bomb. In short, Tolkien lived to witness the fulfillment of Nietzsche's dire prophecy in Ecce Homo. Said Nietzsche, "There will be wars such as have never happened on the earth." Of course, there were, as you know, more people were killed in the 20th century by violent means than in all of the preceding centuries combined. Roughly 180 million. So how could Tolkien write a mythology for England that would not be nationalistic, would not be chauvinistic, that would not be England über alles? He found his answer in the world of the ancient North. Beowulf, the Eddas, Kalevala. Because he came to see that all of these great northern epics do something unlike the epics of the Mediterranean, Greco-Roman world. They enshrine not victory, but loss as their very center. And so he hit upon a way of creating a mythology for England that would not be triumphalistic, militaristic, chauvinistic. And that was, of course, by enshrining loss rather than victory at the core of his epic. This is a quest not to find the Holy Grail, but to lose the modern Holy Grail of absolute power and coercion. Coercion is for Tolkien the prime characteristic of the modern world. And he means by that not just because it has taken by violence 180 million lives, because rather it puts under pressure human beings who were never made to resist such pressures. And that therefore evil has taken a new form in the modern world, the form of radical coercion, where in totalitarian states everybody is spying on everybody else. If you don't submit to the government, you know that you will suffer unbelievable consequences, hideously horrible consequences. And so he makes the chief characteristic of the ring to be coercion. And by the way, I argue, I don't have time for it here, that we in the West have our own coercions altogether as great as the totalitarian worlds do. I argued in a seminar yesterday here wonderful Notre Dame undergraduates, one of our friends here is from, that the chief form of coercion in our culture is sex, drugs, and entertainment, whereby many of our young people have their freedom crushed before they even begin. They're so sucked into our culture, they have no way of resisting it. It overwhelms them before they know it. I used a really crude example of a girl attending my class at Baylor, a freshman, who wore a T-shirt, and across the front it read, "Goats do like to nibble." So you see, this girl is already gone. She didn't know it. She has no idea that she has already been made a slut without ever having said, "Now I think I'll become a slut." So it was not a matter of her freedom being misused. It's a matter of her freedom being absolutely crushed and coerced. Notice how that happens precisely also in Tolkien. The ring has this almost irresistible seductive power, even and especially among those who most resisted. Not just, of course, the way Gollum fell to it, not just the way Bilbo became attached to it, not the way in which Sam, though he has it just for a moment, is mesmerized by it, envisioning himself as the greatest gardener of the world, so forth, but the way in which Frodo is overwhelmed at the end. Peter Jackson misses this entirely, it seems to me. And this is the most crucial point of the epic, is its anticlimax. Namely, Frodo, remember, he's weak. He is so emaciated that Sam can literally carry him up Mount Doom. He's been without drink. The only food has been the limbos that they have, the Eucharistic kind of bread. And he says, "I began to see the ring in my mind all the time, like a great wheel of fire. I'm naked in the dark, Sam, and there's no veil between me and the wheel of fire. I begin to see it even with my waking eyes, and all else fails." Yet when he gets up to the very cracks of Mount Doom, barely able to speak, weakened beyond any kind of display of strength. Remember what happens when Gollum leaps on him to try to steal the ring from him? He flings Gollum off as if he were an insect. And Sam is stunned by this sudden display of Frodo's power. Where does it come from? Well, clearly Frodo's bringing himself, despite his emaciation, his weakness, the weight of the ring, to the highest moment of his resistance. And what happens at the highest moment of his resistance? We hear this voice coming from Frodo. Loud, stentorian voice, clearly not his own voice, saying, "I have come, but I do not choose now to do what I came to do. I will not do this deed. The ring is mine." That's not Frodo's voice. That's the ring ventriloquizing through Frodo. So completely has it crushed his freedom at the highest point of his resistance to evil. Now that's a very un-American moment. Students have an extremely hard time getting that. My friend Will Williman says it is impossible to teach the doctrine of original sin to anybody from Kansas. I mean, we Americans believe that anything broken can be fixed. God darn it, it's like a fence. Fix it. Tolkien is saying there are evils that cannot be fixed, that simply overwhelm us, that absolutely crush our freedom, and that's the chief characteristic of the modern world. Fourth, and finally, I'm going to leave off my conclusion, so quickly, my fourth point. Tolkien argues that the only way, and this seems to me a very great postmodern moment, to resist this kind of coercive evil is by way of small communities of the weak and the emarginated. Notice, for example, how that favorite word now used in every American university to describe itself, diversity, is at work in the ring. Someone has made a survey of American college catalogs and looked at their statements of purpose. The one word that appears now in every American college catalog is diversity. When I was at Wake Forest, some of us would do what we call our diversity doohickey. You know, we'd get up and sing, diversity, oh, diversity. But look how diverse the company is. Historic enemies in Legolas, Elf, Gimli, Dwarf. They're all chosen not because they are of different gender, race, and class, the favorite words, but because they all bring unique strengths to a common task. Aragorn chosen, of course, because of his royal link to the ring, to the throne of Gondor. Gandalf chosen, of course, for his magnificent wisdom. Sam chosen because he's the absolutely loyal, trustworthy servant of Frodo. But what about Merry and Pippin? When they say they want to go, Elrond says they couldn't possibly understand what lies ahead of them. Gandalf says that's right, they can't. But they would be ashamed of themselves for backing out, and thus would feel worse at not going than they will from going and facing terrible difficulties. But the chief moment comes, it seems to me, as it's voiced by Merry. When Frodo says he's willing to go without them, Merry says, we can't let you go, Frodo. We are your friends. And those four monosyllables. If Sauron could have heard and fathomed them, his great tower at Barad-dûr, his mighty fortress there, would have been shaken to its foundations. Because Tolkien places community built on trusting friendship as the ultimate answer to massive, coercive evil of the kind we have in our time. And it's a friendship that is not simply of the like-minded. It's a friendship based on forgiveness, pity. That's the operative word in Tolkien. That's the leitmotif of his whole book. Jackson throws Gandalf's great speech on pity away. It appears only briefly at the end of near the end of the first movie, never recurring again, though it recurs throughout the Lord of the Rings. The pity of Bilbo may rule the fate of many. That's the only sentence repeated in all three volumes, because it's clearly the leitmotif. So let me finish by describing how Boromir is forgiven. You know, forgiveness is offered in the ancient world. Pity is offered in the ancient world, never to the egregiously evil. Forgiveness is a uniquely Christian virtue. In the ancient world of both the North and the South, you have pity only upon the weak, the pathetic, those simply who cannot manage for themselves. Never pity upon the strong, and least of all upon those who are wicked, for they would be denied justice thereby. Tolkien enshrines pity at the center of his epic because it, of course, is the highest of the Christian virtues. Love, understood as mercy, forgiveness. Boromir, in any ancient epic, would have been ruled out. He would have been slain for what he did. He, after all, is one who breaks the company. Company is not broken from without by, a warg or an orc or even Saruman. It's broken from within by one of their own. And therefore, by all rights, he should have been not only ousted, but executed. What happens instead is that Tolkien does a very sneaky thing. He offers, as I was suggesting to our class yesterday, a Catholic sacrament of penance, what now called, of course, reconciliation. Remember when they get back and find Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, that Boromir's dying from the orc wounds he's received. He says, I tried to seize the ring from Frodo. What Catholics used to call confessio oris, confession of the mouth. He's dying, he says, but I'm sorry. Contritio cordis, contrition of the heart. But I killed all the orcs I could, that Sam and Frodo could go free. Satisfactio operis, deeds done in satisfaction. And so what does Aragorn do? He gives him absolution. He takes his hand and kisses him on the brow and said, "You are dying not in defeat, but in victory. You are not losing, but winning." And what he means, of course, you've won by losing yourself. I've gone over. I was right about Baptists not meaning a thing with their watches. So let me take some questions, and I'm sorry that I didn't get to my fourth point. Comments, questions, rejoinders, refutations. Yes, right here.
I'm not that familiar with Tolkien's works. I have read The Lord of the Rings. I do know he wrote extensively other histories regarding the Lord of the Rings. Out of his whole corpus, what percent would you say deals with this type of material?
Well, all of it. You know, we now have 12 volumes called The History of the People of Middle-earth, each of them 500 pages long, that Tolkien's son Christopher spent his entire career putting together. They all deal with these things, but there's a fundamental shift in Tolkien that my student Helen Lassiter here is tracing in her doctoral dissertation at Baylor. In the early work of Tolkien, especially in the Silmarillion, he interprets the Anglo-Saxon word weird, W-Y-R-D, as what it meant in the Anglo-Saxon world, fate. And there are some very deeply fatalistic stories in the Silmarillion. Because after all, Tolkien was given to a kind of fatalism after what he saw at work in the First War. But you probably know the story that after The Hobbit succeeded so magnificently and so surprisingly, Tolkien's publishers came to him at Oxford and said, "We want more." And so Tolkien goes upstairs and comes down with a huge sheaf of things he'd been working on for 30 years, the Silmarillion in that shape. And Rainer Unman said, "Oh my God, this is like reading the phone book in Elvish. Nobody would have any interest in this. Give us more hobbits." And so he set himself the task of injecting these little creatures into the grand legendarium of the Silmarillion. And in so doing, my student is arguing, he gradually alters his understanding of weird, as it was altered, of course, in the Anglo-Saxon world as it was Christianized, from fate to providence. Because after all, what happens after Frodo is overwhelmed? Gollum bites the ring from his finger, does his jig of joy too close to the volcanic fissure that can melt the ring, falls backward into it, and thus you can see, just as Bilbo was meant to find the ring, so was, in a real sense, the ring meant to be destroyed. And so you get a deep, deep providential sense running throughout the Lord of the Rings. And so he undergoes some changes there, even though his general theme remains the same. Yes, ma'am.
I just want to compliment you. This was an extraordinary lecture. I think it's
Gosh, I know it was a mess.
and I think part of the silence is just that I have to personally digest a lot of what you've said so much, and I've taken extensive notes. So I'll go back and probably in a few hours have very. But I think what impresses me so much is I'm a convert to Catholicism of some 20 years, but you seem to get Tolkien so much from its Catholic sensibility. I'm just curious how you've gotten so inside of Catholicism from my.
Thank you. Well, Tolkien, of course, I call myself a Bapto-Catholic, by the way. I'm not an Anglo-Catholic, but a Bapto-Catholic. Tolkien said he did not realize how Catholic his work was until he rewrote it and began to see that his Catholicism was in his bones and in his blood, and therefore it just comes pouring out his fingertip. He said, for example, I could not have conceived of Galadriel without my devotion to the Blessed Virgin. There's no doubt that he could not have created Limbos without his devotion to the Holy Eucharist. But he said, my Catholicism comes through the structure and form of the work, not through a kind of overt theme. He says, I work by indirection than by direction. He says, I am no sort of evangelist. That's what, of course, C.S. Lewis called it. I'm an evangelist. Tolkien says, I'm not. And I think that's a real postmodern strategy. That is to say, people are won over by Tolkien's tact of indirection far more than they are by a kind of blunt fist to the jaw of direction. My very first year as a teacher, I did Tolkien 33 years ago, and a student came up to me after class and made a confession I've never forgotten. I'm still trying to fathom. He said, when I read Tolkien, I feel clean. I pondered what that meant. Obviously, no foul language, not even four-letter words from Anglo-Saxon, no gross sexuality. And even the violence is very limited, by the way. That's where the movies are so distorting. Battle of Helm's Deep takes 20 minutes in the second film, 8 or 9 pages in The Two Towers. But what he meant, I think, was Tolkien makes goodness winsome, attractive, because he makes it so complicated. It's not sugary goodness. C.S. Lewis once said it's impossible to make righteousness readable. Tolkien makes righteousness readable because it's not false righteousness. And thus he wins over huge millions of readers by this tact of indirection, far more powerful than it seems to be direction would have been. So when his readers miss the Christian overtones, he said, it doesn't bother me at all. He says, because if my work has to have Christian props, it's not worth anything. It must stand on its own as good art. And that was a part of his faith, I think, as a Catholic. God will do the converting. I don't have to do it. Yes, sir.
So there are two characters in the books that are able to resist the
Yes.
temptation.
Who are they?
Bombadil and Faramir.
Yeah.
Both of which, by the way, are either left out or screwed up by the movies.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
What can those characters tell us about?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Let me preface my answer by saying that on the whole, Frodo and Sam and Bilbo, the three other possessors of the ring, resist it so mightily because their character has been formed so deeply. As I was saying to this young man's class yesterday here, if Notre Dame and Baylor are serious about their business, they will be teaching in order to form character. I mean, Aristotle defined education precisely as that, training in virtue. So we're not about smorgasbord, pick out this or that, whatever you might like. We should be about the business of the formation of character. Their character has been so deeply formed by life in the Shire. Bilbo has schooled Frodo that they are able to resist on the whole. Faramir is what the New Testament calls an Israelite without guile. He is pure in a way that makes him immune in a very mysterious way. I think the closest thing to Faramir would be a thorough saint, a real saint. He's not canonized. He says, if I were to see the ring lying by the road, I wouldn't pick it up. Amazing. Bombadil, by contrast, I have this private theory of Bombadil nobody likes, but I'm not unwilling to try it out even so. Because Tolkien had created Bombadil early in his work. And a lot of people say, heck, he just wanted to stick it in, so stuck it in. I don't think Tolkien's that bad an artist. I argue in my book that Tolkien is a Catholic in the sense of being a wonderful medievalist who has a completely hierarchical universe. Everything is ranged. Everything is displayed in perfect order. But to remind us that the universe is not completely explicable by our own terms, he creates a character who doesn't fit anywhere. So I'm glad that Jackson didn't include Bombadil because he doesn't fit. And here's how he doesn't fit in my view. Bombadil is right on the border between the animal and the human, it seems to me. He has a territorial imperative so that when the company enters his territory and captured by Old Man Willie, he liberates them. But that's a kind of animal instinct. He has no comprehension of the ring's significance, so when he puts it on, he doesn't disappear. He is immune. And therefore, he is a creature that I regard as amoral, incapable of moral distinctions, and therefore neither good nor evil. but kind of invincibly ignorant, I guess you might say in Catholic terms. And Tolkien places him there as a creature of great interest, but finally of utter insignificance to the quest. And the analogy I use in my book is this one. As you know, when a medieval cathedral was finally finished, they would send someone shimmying up the very highest spire with some wet mortar in one hand and with an icon in the other. And on the very highest spire, they would put this icon, this mortar, and then plant the icon there for God alone to enjoy. This, I think, is Tolkien's monkish gift to Illuvatar. Thank you very much.